Hello everyone and welcome back into the final edition of the week here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Christopher Shepard. As always, thank you for joining me on this lovely Friday afternoon. We have a great show ahead talking all things NBA All-Star Weekend, whether it be the new format, who was left out potentially, and how these different contests are looking, especially the dunk contest, as we have a rare opportunity there to talk about. But ultimately, should be a very fun show. And we conclude our show with a final Bubble Watch segments talking about some mid-major teams to look out for as potential Cinderellas in your bracket come March Madness time. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, as always, if you haven't done so already and you feel so inclined, like, follow, and subscribe to all our shows and the network itself to keep up to date with all the new content that goes on around the GSMC network. But if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly whilst we are live streaming, consider availing yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, where you can leave all things such as feedback, opinion, inputs throughout the show, as well as tips and donations, and everything that you do for our shows is genuinely appreciated, and it just makes them that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to them. But without further ado, let us jump right into this All-Star Weekend talk. Now, before we get into anything, I do want to clarify that this was kind of planned before the draft, before we fully understood what this format was going to be. So I apologize if I don't necessarily come across as, say, too knowledgeable about certain players within the format and how this will all work and pan out. But fortunately, I do feel like this show will run as smoothly as possible because I did do enough research to where I feel like I can at least talk with the players rather than focus on the format. But for those who potentially are not that familiar with the format, I'll briefly go over before we get into talking about the players, especially within the Eastern Conference, because I think that's the conference with a lot of controversy in terms of starters and reserves. So, in terms of format, it's going to be a 4-team format. So, it's basically Shaq, Kenny Smith, and Charles Barkley having teams based on a certain categorization. For example, Shaq's team's going to be the OGs, Kenny's going to be like the young stars of the league, and Charles gets all the international stars. And then the 4th team will be coached by Candace Parker, and it'll be the winner, I believe, of the Rising Stars competition, which has its own little format as well. But I do think that in this format, it gets us to better determine and analyze who we believe was snubbed and who we believe does not necessarily deserve as many players, especially in the Eastern Conference. Because the Eastern Conference, I don't necessarily believe is as stacked as the Western Conference, but still has a lot of contentious points to talk about. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting off with the starters, right? And I think the main area of controversy that we can point at is the fact that there are 2 Knicks starters over the 2 teams ahead of them in the Eastern Conference right now, the Celtics and the Cavs. And I know a lot of people within both of those fan bases would be clamoring for players such as Derek White from the Celtics, maybe even Chris Stapps, the way he's been playing as of late. And then for the Cavs, definitely guys like Garland and guys like Mobley to start. But here's the thing about the 2 Knicks starters, who are obviously Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns. I feel like at their respective positions, and because of the way they play, most importantly the volume of time they are on the court, it really lends value to their all-star cases. Let's start off with Karl Anthony Towns, because the main player he's most likely rivaling in people's minds, or at the time of not just all-star voting, but fan voting as well, was Evan Mobley. And if you compare them, Evan Mobley, in my opinion, is the far more efficient player, playing a much bigger role in his squad and impacting them in a much larger manner. But Cat, because he plays such a high volume and he's integrated himself so seamlessly into this New York Knicks starting five, I think you can make the case that he's not just arguably the best center in the Eastern Conference, but playing some of the best basketball at the position as of late, heading into the All-Star game especially. He's coming off at, 2 straight 40-point performances. So I feel like although the case can definitely be made that Evan Mobley's improvement could have saw him get a starting role in one of these teams, and I think he's going to see a lot of minutes on Team Kenny, I do feel like Karl Anthony Towns just made himself even more high profile, not just from this trade to the Knicks, but how he's fit in this system, especially with the next guy in question, Jalen Brunson. They run one of the most dangerous pick and rolls in the league. But that's not the reason why Brunson's inclusion as a starter is as contentious as it is. I think that because of both of these players playing so well together, it's kind of fair to lump them into the same mindset of inclusion as starters. But for Brunson, it's a little bit easier to describe, in my opinion, because at least for Cat, you can point to his volume over a guy like Mobley, and especially his experience over a guy like Mobley as the reason as to why he was included as a starter. But for Brunson, just look at the depth in the East in terms of backcourt players. Obviously, Trae Young was chosen as the injury replacement for Giannis Antetokounmpo. And you have a guy like Tyrese Maxey, who's now averaging the most points in the Eastern Conference at the point guard position. And Tyler Hero, because now the absence of Jimmy Butler, not just for the past weeks, but for a long time now, because he's off to Golden State, amping up his minutes and usage rate. Jalen Brunson doesn't necessarily have that much competition. You can point to certain guys in the Eastern Conference that could have made a case, but I feel like due to circumstances outside of their control, Tyrese Maxey and Tyler Hero were kind of forced into that role. Jalen Brunson has been doing this consistently. Then you look to guys, say, like Cade Cunningham and Tyrese Halliburton, and then a guy like Damian Lillard, who expect to be in the conversation as well. Damian Lillard really right now is starting to become more of a closer rather than an all-around player like Brunson, in my opinion. He definitely has the shooting prowess, but I don't necessarily know if he has the consistent level and the bag of tricks that Jalen Brunson has. And we point to a guy like Halliburton. Halliburton last year could have made the case to be on par with Jalen Brunson, but this year has fallen off dramatically, as well as this Indiana Pacers team. So the fact that the Pacers and Halliburton aren't performing equally as well as we expect them to, that sees him lose a bit of his luster. And Cade Cunningham really is playing at a very high level himself, but he's on a surprising Detroit Pistons team that, although a lot of people really have seemingly been higher on them as of late, are not necessarily a high-profile team where Cade Cunningham and his skills are on high display all the time. And then let's point to the last guy of interest here, but actually the last two guys, considering on how you viewed a guy like Donovan Mitchell, both Garland and Mitchell, right? And that's where the controversy stems from. If Garland and Mitchell played in a bigger market, say, and potentially didn't necessarily have to play off each other all the time, then I could see a way for both of them potentially be starters because of Jalen Brunson's volume of play, even though he hasn't necessarily been playing the most minutes in the Eastern Conference at the position. What with his tandem with Karl Anthony Towns, what with the fact that they both play in a New York market that gets a lot of attention on the third best team in the Eastern Conference. I feel like that kind of trumps what Garland and Mitchell are doing, even though in my eyes the underlying metrics say that Garland and Mitchell are doing the more impressive work for this highly overachieving, in my opinion, Cleveland Cavaliers team. So that's kind of the criticism of at least the starters here. Then we get to the reserves, and a lot of them fall in Team Kenny's camp, right? Because these guys are considered the quote-unquote, not in my honest opinion, the afterthoughts of the Eastern Conference. Obviously, we just talked about Cunningham and Garland, and because of their play, they're kind of lock reserves. Cunningham elevating the Detroit Pistons, Garland overachieving with Cleveland. Then you look down the list, you have guys like Tyler Hero, whose role was made even larger over the past couple of weeks due to the absence of Jimmy Butler, who's now off to Golden State, like we just said. Then you have, I think, Tyrese Maxey will play for Team Kenny. Don't quote me on that because I didn't necessarily check all of Team Kenny's roster, to be honest with you. I don't have much hope for them in this tournament-style format. But I do think that ultimately, when you look at the reserves that the East have, they're a lot weaker than we can say about the West. Because the West, to me, has a lot of international talent that's going to be on Team Charles Barkley, who I'm really intrigued to see. And then you go into the Rising Stars team, and there are definitely some players that will excite more so on the Western Conference side of things. But there are several locks, in my mind, for the East All-Star Reserve that definitely deserve to be there. Garland for his play, Cunningham, Hero, Maxey. The most egregious person left out, LaMelo Ball. And I think that's more so as to how Charlotte's performing, and not just his performance in a nutshell, but it's pretty damning to have someone with LaMelo Ball stats not in the All-Star game. But I do think that the East Conference overall has been a little bit weaker than we expected this year. But let me know what you think in the comments about all the Eastern Conference All-Stars, because there are a lot of questions that can still be asked. But coming next, we transition to the West to talk about all the controversy questions and probably answer some of those questions in the next segment right after this short break. But continue to let me know what you think of the Eastern Conference All-Stars in the comment section below.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you as always to avail yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, to better contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly whilst we are live streaming. Just makes the show that much better, and it's genuinely appreciated by all concerned when you, our faithful audience, are doing your best to contribute to the importance and integrity of the show. Without further ado, let's jump right into the second segment, transitioning from the Eastern Conference All-Stars to the Western Conference All-Stars. Definitely the more loaded conference, which leaves more questions up for debate about it. And I do feel that injuries played a large part into how the Western Conference All-Stars are viewed. But I do think that because of the delineation of these teams, specifically because of this format, it allows for less questions about the East to arise, but certainly still some contentious points to go over here in the Western Conference, especially at certain positions. Without further ado, let's jump right into the goings-on of the Western Conference All-Stars. Starting off with, obviously, Steph Curry, the home court guy, getting some home court love. And yes, I understand it. Steph Curry will certainly go down as one of the best point guards of all time, and he deserves to get some love in his home state. But look at the Western Conference backcourt. A lot of depth there. In a nutshell, Devin Booker certainly can be considered one of the 12 best players in the Western Conference. If it weren't for that calf strain, Luka Doncic would certainly be a unanimous starter in my opinion. And this is no indictment of Steph Curry, especially this season, because he has proved it of late with 4 straight 30-point games that he deserves to be an all-star starter. But considering the fact that it is at Oracle, and there's a lot of hype around Steph Curry anyways, as he's been a large part of All-Stars proceedings over his career. And you got the attention last year through that 3-point contest with Sabrina Ionescu. And I don't necessarily think that his reputation is going to be tarnished by the scrapping of this year's 3-point contest against Ionescu just because Caitlin Clark actually didn't decide to do it. I think that you look at the depth, and yes, Kyrie was just added to replace his now teammate Anthony Davis, and I do think that's cool and all, but looking at how the Western Conference backcourt has panned out, and the early start to the season for Steph Curry compared to now, and his overall basis of work, I don't necessarily think that he's an all-star, but he did prove over the past 4 games that he can still play at that caliber, and Jimmy Butler has opened up some avenues for him as that deep threat as of late again. And with that balance, who knows? I think that it will eventually, towards the end of the season, towards the stretch run as the Golden State Warriors are fighting for playoff positioning, go down as an underrated all-star season for him. But for now, I feel like there will still be questions surrounding his candidacy as an all-star starter, even though he's one of the great point guards of all time on Team Shaq, and as of late has proven that he deserves to be here. But, hypothetically speaking, that Luka calf strain really changed everything. So, maybe a little bit of luck in Steph Curry's favor here. Then let's talk about the front court, because this is where we can get a little bit crazy here. LeBron, obviously, one of the great players of all time. Maybe to some, the greatest. He obviously has been to many an all-star game, finds himself as one of the captains of Team Shaq. But we're looking at the future of the NBA here. We're looking at the future of the big man position especially. And LeBron James, yeah, people can say he'll play for the next potentially decade or so, but you look at the youthful front court depth in the Western Conference specifically, and Victor Wembanyama has to be on your mind if you're an all-star voter. And obviously, LeBron has had great stats this season. He's still playing at a very high level, doing it at the age of 40. 23.7 points per game, 9 assists, 7.5 rebounds. But Victor Wembanyama is having one of the great seasons by a young big man in NBA history. He's the league leader in blocks, and he's doing a lot of things, breaking a lot of records before, a certain age, unlike many great players before him. So if this were any season to say that Victor Wembanyama is becoming the next face of the league, this was it. And I think that LeBron, even though Wemby was ahead of him in terms of the fan vote, just has a little bit more of that allure, right? He has the pull of national markets, and being on Team Shaq, another legendary player, with all these OG guys of his generation, with Curry, with Durant, with guys of that ilk, and then guys who are getting up there in this generation, like the Tatums and Browns of the world, just goes to show that right now, as long as LeBron is playing in this league, and as long as he can maintain a certain level of consistency, I feel like, it's always going to be about him until he retires. And I think that Wemby right now is content to garner as many All-Star appearances as possible, especially in this new format that's more favorable to him. But this seemed like a subtle diss at the growth of a player who we know is going to be a generational talent for years to come. So that's why I feel there's a little bit of controversy, maybe not so much as the Steph Curry controversy as a starter, but LeBron over Wemby at the age he's at probably is the bigger statement than, say, comparing their stats. Because I do think that they're comparable in terms of the metrics here. But in age, that's where I think a couple people might bat an eye. Now let's talk about the MVP race and how that'll be brought to the forefront here. Because I believe SGA and Jokic are on the same team. Don't quote me on that because I don't know if SGA is Canadian or not. And he might be on Team Kenny. I'll have to check after this. So don't quote me on that. But I love the dichotomy of these two players, right? Because you have a player in Nikola Jokic who is going to go down as one of the all-time great centers, right? He has an incredible resume and his ability as a big man to pick you apart from every level of the court and his high offensive IQ. He's going to be a star in many people's minds for many generations to come. And SGA, on the other hand, very flashy point guard, the leading scorer in the league, leading this young Thunder squad to Western Conference supremacy, hopefully for them. Compare them, though, and they're drastically different players when they enter the All-Star Game world. Nikola Jokic is not necessarily as coveted as, say, a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And especially on Team Barkley, where you have a lot of international talent. The international talent that is there is heavily suited for big men. Whereas a guy like Shai is kind of anomalous in a team like Charles Barkley's because of his flashy talent. But in terms of format, this kind of changes everything because it gives a kind of balance to all the different positions. It gives more of an importance to, say, a guy like Jokic, perhaps. Because by putting him in this kind of squad, where he's not the only big man, I feel like that will allow him to just take this as it comes to him. Because before, he wasn't necessarily, the most coveted player in terms of the draft system when guys like LeBron and Durant were drafting their teams because, well, he's not the sexiest option in a all-star setting. But I do believe that putting him in this team of international superstars that's very heavily centered around big men makes him far more appealing and far more exciting. And pairing him up with SGA just makes this MVP race very, very appealing as well, because they'll be playing with each other and trying to make magic happen in the pick and roll game, and it could be a very intriguing storyline as we go along. And overall, the Western Conference compared to the Eastern Conference, at least in my opinion, stems down to more talent and depth to choose from. While I feel like the Eastern Conference had a couple more snubs, LaMelo Ball is a prime example, the Western Conference has more questions about where to fit all its talent, especially how dominant they are at the center and forward positions. Because all of Team Barkley is talented big men combined with a couple point guards who still could perform well in all-star setting, but ultimately not necessarily the best guards they could have gotten in terms of depth in this conference. And that's why I come back to injury woes, because how exciting could Team Barkley have been if it were Nikola Jokic, SGA, and Doncic? Because that would have been a really exciting combination that would have got a lot of people to tune in. But nevertheless, I do feel that a lot more of the Western Conference players appeal to a national market, whereas the East, it kind of stems down to volume of work, right? Because that's how two Knicks are on the team when a lot of people in Boston and Cleveland are disappointed, right? So that's why I feel like the Western Conference is way more interesting to analyze. But let me know what you think in the comments below, because the Western Conference has more talent, but I think that the Eastern Conference really has more debate and more interest in terms of that debate as a result as well. But coming up next, we transition over to one of the NBA's most thrilling competitions, not necessarily of late, but this year especially could be very special. And we're going to talk about the reason why after this short break. It's the NBA contest, dunk contest, right after we come back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our third segment of today's show, we'll be looking at one of the NBA's most thrilling parts and aspects of their All-Star Weekend, the dunk contest. But as of late, it has kind of lost a little bit of its luster just because none of the big stars are willing to participate within it, and a lot of people want to see that happen. And I feel like because of that, the dunk contest has to come down to unheard of talent that really not a lot of people are hyped up about. And as a result, I think the quality of dunks has decreased year after year. But in this year's competition, something very special could happen for a very special player who, although is a G Leaguer and has gotten flack for that, is still one of the most talented dunkers we've ever seen grace this competition. Mac McClung. This year, he could become the first player since Nate Robinson did before him to three-peat in the NBA dunk contest. And if we go back and actually look at the players who have won this competition 2 times, you can reminisce of old. And that's the beauty of this. Michael Jordan, Jason Richardson, Dominique Wilkins, all 2-time winners, and reminding us of a time where NBA stars of the league actually took this competition seriously. Now, all hope for the dunk contest future lies in the shoulders of a young G Leaguer trying to three-peat and bring back creativity to the dunk contest. 3 new participants enter the ring to try and take him down, and hopefully we'll get an exhilarating competition like the years of old. Without further ado, let's take a look at all of the contestants trying to knock Mac McClung down a peg this year. Starting off with the young man out of UConn and a second-year player from Milwaukee, Andre Jackson. I feel like the hype around this young man is the ability to live above the rim. And over the past years, we've gotten a lot of creative dunks that incorporated a lot of action above the rim from players, whether it be trying to tap the backboard twice like Pat Connaughton and blow out a candle on a cupcake like Anthony Simons, even kiss the rim like Anthony Simons tried to do. I feel like Andre Jackson's appeal stems from his ability to get height on each and every single one of his dunks. For example, a couple weeks ago, we had a putback dunk where his head was above the rim. Just goes to show you his verticality, and that's where I think he can shine. Now, I feel like in terms of creativity and flair, I'm not necessarily certain that he will incorporate enough in that aspect in terms of behind the back action, East Bay action, between the leg action, and things of that nature. But I do think that living above the rim can earn you a lot of points. I don't necessarily think he'll get many 50s, but in terms of his verticality alone, that will impress the judges to put him at least in the high 40s, 45 to 47, around that range, dunk after dunk. And I feel like out of all these players, he has a chance to potentially make the final against a guy like Mac McClung and push him in terms of verticality. But I don't necessarily think that if he goes up, say, against the McClung or another guy we're going to talk about later in the competition, he'll win in terms of creativity, because Mac McClung is always thinking about how he can add flair to his bag of tricks as well. So, Andre Jackson Jr., I'm excited to see what he brings, intrigued to see if he can actually make a go of this thing in terms of the sheer height he gets in some of his dunks, but I'm not certain he'll come out a winner. So, that's all there is to be said about Andre Jackson Jr. for now, and hopefully tomorrow night he'll show his stuff on the big stage. But then, kind of the dark horse of this competition, Matas Buzelis. It's the first bowl, actually, since Tyrus Thomas will leave the 2004 to 2005 NBA dunk contest to participate, but really not necessarily a player like Andre Jackson Jr. who's going to rely on his height in this competition. What I feel like Matas Buzelis brings to the table is kind of this speed to the rim. He's kind of a slashing forward hybrid guy who will probably get a lot of points in terms of the ferocity of his dunks. I feel like he's going to use that speed, that run up to generate maximum power in throwing it down, but I don't necessarily know if he'll have the creativity and East Bay action that the judges will be looking for in terms of his bag of tricks. I feel like maybe his usage of props could come in handy. He can jump over several people. He has, as well as Jackson Jr., that advantage in terms of verticality. But I'm not necessarily certain, ferocity alone is going to win this competition. Because when I look at the other guys, I think about guys that, yes, are going to be challenged to come up with props or players or creative dunks using every single part of their body to win this competition. And Matas Buzelis, to me, seems like a very linear kind of player. To me, he's going to have to impress in terms of the height he gets, in terms of the length he gets, most importantly, in terms of how viciously he can throw down. Because outside of that, there's not much going for him instead of, just sheer speed to the basket. And that's not always that appealing, in my opinion, when judging these kinds of things. I want to see players get creative when they get to the rim, and Buzelis just kind of is, to me, a little bit too one note, at least in terms of the regular season dunks he's put down in terms of this competition. He may bring out, say, the Bulls mascot and try and do some Aaron Gordon-esque stuff, but I don't necessarily know if he's the kind of player capable of pulling it off like Aaron Gordon was able to. So I feel like Matas Buzelis is the player most expected to finish last in this competition, and I feel like he can get at least into the low 40s, but not necessarily exceed, say, 46, 47 points on several of his dunks, just because I don't necessarily think he has the best bag of tricks at his disposal. Now we get into, in my opinion, the final two we'll get tomorrow night, and a player who has a very special teammate who could come in handy and has the most dunks, actually, of any point guard this season with 25 and counting, Stephon Castle. And I love Stephon Castle. He adds everything Buzelis brings to the table and more: ferocity, speed to the basket, slashing to the rim, and most importantly, the teammate he has that could be a secret weapon going up against a guy like Mac McClung if they truly are going to be the final two in the final round. And I feel like Stephon Castle is the kind of player to pull it off. And if he does pull it off, I would say it's more impressive than, say, dunking over a guy like Shaq, which Mac McClung actually did a couple of years ago, in Taco Fall, which Aaron Gordon did, I believe, in 2018. Victor Wembanyama is a 7'4" guy who looks like he could be 7'8" or taller. And when I compare Victor Wembanyama to the players that other people have dunked over, like Shaq, like Taco Fall, they're more burly guys, right? And when you're burly at that height, you don't seem that tall. And you can get away like Aaron Gordon and Mac McClung did by not necessarily clearing them completely. But if you can clear a guy like Victor Wembanyama, or at least get above him, I feel like that would be one of the most impressive dunks over someone we've seen in the competition's history. And Stephon Castle has the verticality to pull it off. I feel like he's highly underrated in this competition. He has the teammates willing to pull off a lot of tricks. Maybe Chris Paul will get him to do an alley-oop as well. And I feel like he's the most exciting prospect in terms of going toe-to-toe with Mac McClung in this competition. But it's going to be all about if he brings out the big man and he can actually clear him in terms of height, or at the very least get above him to the point where it's as impressive a dunk as, say, dunking over Shaq or Taco Fall as players have done in the past. But ultimately, I feel like out of all the underdogs in this race, Stephon Castle has the ability to come out on top, because Jackson Jr. has the verticality. Modest Buzelis has the ferocity and speed. Stephon Castle, though, has the speed, ferocity, and creativity to match the next man we're going to talk about here. And it's all going to come down to if he's willing to go to the extreme, because Mac McClung goes to the extreme. And it's the reason why he's a two-time defending champion in this competition. He's not necessarily the flashiest guy. He's not necessarily going to wow you with his verticality, even though it is still elite. He's not necessarily going to bring out that many props either. I think the special nature of Mac McClung as a dunker stems from his creativity and his ability to think on the fly, and his ability to improvise, most importantly. I feel like in all the different competitions he's been in, he had a set list of dunks that he was willing to try, and somewhere along the line he said, how can I make this even cooler? How can I add a little bit more creativity to it? And every single time, a dunk that normally, in my opinion, would not come across as appealing in a dunk contest stage as one would expect, becomes one of the better dunks in a competition on any given night, especially in this dunk contest climate. So that's what these competitors are going up against. They're also going against the fact that outside of greats like Michael Jordan, Jason Richardson, Dominique Wilkins, and Nate Robinson, Mac McClung has a chip on his shoulder. He will be the only three-time champion who is not an established NBA player. And that's saying something with the state of this competition. The fact that a G Leaguer has a chance like this to three-peat, even though his competitors have not been the most elite when it comes to taking this competition seriously. That's what I love about Mac McClung. When given the opportunity, he's going to take it and take it in spades. And I'm really excited to see what he brings to the table. Ultimately, though, I'm just hoping for a thrilling dunk contest in general, because over the years, it's been very lackluster. And yes, Mac McClung has had very impressive performances over the past 2 years, but they've been just about it. There's been really no one to challenge him in terms of dunking supremacy, and I want this year to be a year where a new talent can emerge who will be willing to go again and again, like a guy like Mac McClung has been willing to do these past 3 years. Ultimately, that's the big question. Can Mac McClung, a young G Leaguer out of Gate City High School, win the competition 3 times? Something that no one outside of Nate Robinson has done. Imagine that narrative. One of the shortest men to play in the NBA wins it 3 times, and a young G Leaguer wins it 3 times. Something that not many players can say they've done. Let me know what you think about the dunk contest. Coming in next, we transition from talk of the All-Star Game to our final bubble watch segments of this March Madness period, talking about the mid-major teams that could be potential Cinderellas for you in your brackets come March Madness time. We'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we're going to be getting into the final bubble watch segments of the March Madness period right now. We're talking about the mid-majors, both high and low, the potential dark horse Cinderellas come March Madness time. We're going to be starting off with the high mid-majors teams in the A10, the Missouri Valley Conference. Not yet teams like Gonzaga and St. Mary's that will be coming in our last segment of today's show. The teams that I feel like are very heavily honing in on winning their conference tournament and not leaving it up to chance, because as we all know, mid-majors really don't get many shots at putting multiple teams in out of their conferences. So all of these teams are either favorites to win their respective conference tournaments or just struggling to not be teams on the outside looking in because they are mid-majors. So without further ado, let's jump right into the bubble watch segment for the high mid-majors here. And now I'm kind of familiar with some of these teams, but bear with me if I get some of these team names wrong or players wrong here, because these are teams that I feel like, while are going to be constantly monitored as they head into the conference tournament, are not going to be as high profile as other conference tournaments. So without further ado, let's just get right into them. Starting off with a team I'm actually very familiar with. Did watch this team last year in the 8-10 conference championship in a heartbreaking loss to Duquesne. All too familiar with them as someone who went to an 8-10 school and Fordham. The VCU Rams. Although I like to think as a Fordham alumni that we are the ultimate Rams, but VCU can hold that title because they are the better team right now. They have won 4 straight and have 10 in 11 games. They are above 65% in terms of the ESPN forecast for getting into the tournament. But I do think that a lot of that hinges on them winning the A10 conference tournament, unlike last year. But I do feel like there is a little bit margin for error for VC because the A10 has always had at the very least 2 teams get in. They don't necessarily have to win their conference tournament, but I do think that they are expected to, and because of that, should get in as the auto bid here. They only rank 54th in strength of record, though, so it's not necessarily certain in terms of their auto bid status, but I do think that because they are the best team by many considered in the A10, I do think that that profile gives them that extra level of confidence heading into this, that they could potentially get an auto bid. But I do think that the challenge is the depth of this conference once the conference tournament starts, because last year nobody expected Duquesne to win the entire thing, and he ultimately did. So that's the challenge here. Facing teams that are motivated by the conference tournament and trying to knock down a team like VCU, who's dominated the regular season, down a peg. And Dayton's still always in the conversation. But what I love about VCU is that they returned 2 of their stars from last year in Max Shulga and Joe Bamasile, and I love that inside-outside duo a lot. Fantastic player is Max Shulga, especially in the mid-range, and Joe Bamasile is an elite center down low, both offensively and defensively. So I do think that this team has a pretty decent chance of getting in through their conference championship. Now let's talk about another team in Conference USA, because this team, I feel, is in a conference that isn't necessarily high profile at the mid-major level. It's definitely going to stem down to winning the conference tournament, in my opinion, because they're only at a 45% chance right now, and it's boosted by the fact that they're the favorite to win the Conference USA tournament. It's the Liberty Flames. They have an elite inside-outside duo themselves in star guard Caden Metheny and Zach Cleveland, but I do think that this is, again, another team, because of its mid-major status, that's not going to be in the high profile, and thus it's going to have to be considered as a conference champion. If they fail, I feel like the CUSA does not have the ilk and the magnitude of other mid-majors to expect them to be in the tournament as an auto bid. They're only expected to put forth one team, and they haven't sent multiple teams to the dance since 2012. So Liberty now is up against it. They did boost their resume a bit more slightly by beating Mexico State. That's their 6th win in 7 games, but it's definitely a resume that's only boosted by their favoritism in the CUSA conference tournament. So I wouldn't necessarily hedge my bets on them as a dark horse until the job is done, but much like VCU, that inside-outside duo of Metheny and Zach Cleveland can carry them very far. So look out for them if they make the tournament, but don't expect more than one CUSA team to get in, unlike, say, potentially the A10, where VCU doesn't necessarily have to win its tournament, but has a little bit more margin for error. Then let's get into the Missouri Valley Conference favorite, who has been the favorite, everyone's favorite team and favorite underdog once they reach the NCAA tournament, and that is the Drake Bulldogs. Unfortunately, they do not have the DeVries brothers anymore, but what they do have is an elite record. They continue to roll in the MVC with their 11th consecutive win on Wednesday against Illinois State on the road. But they have only gotten one NCAA bid as a conference 6 times in the past 7 tournaments. So I do think that the fate of Drake and another team like Bradley looking to get into the tournament are still up in the air. Drake has a better chance than Bradley at 71%, and Bradley's only hovering around 20%. And they do have a 23-2 record, and that puts them in a top 35 at least in the strength of record and wins above bubble categories. But against a non-existent schedule, basically, at 178th in the country in terms of strength, I do feel like a conference tournament win will ensure that nothing gets left a chance. But like I said, if they do get into the tournament, I wouldn't necessarily hedge my bets on them, because compared to last year, they don't have either one of the DeVries brothers to carry them, and it's a very small squad, actually, looking at it. I was looking at it on ESPN earlier, and they only have about 12 to 15 players from their squad. They're led by guard Bennett Sturtz, a very experienced player, and Mitch Muscari as well, but ultimately, this team isn't necessarily going to be as scary as years past, in my humble opinion. And because they haven't been tested in the Missouri Valley Conference, I don't necessarily view them as a threat, as a Cinderella in this year's tournament. Now let's look at some other schools before we get into the Lowman Majors, the Gonzagas and St. Mary's of the world. How about the Utah State Aggies? I like this Utah State Aggies team a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about them in length in the next segment. They are looking for their 3rd consecutive NCAA tournament trip, but I do think that to preserve that level of certainty, a win, I believe, in the Mountain West Conference will help them. Then we look at a team that could struggle to get in out of the Mountain West Conference themselves. The Boise State Broncos really don't have a very strong resume themselves. They only rank 63rd in strength of record and 59th in wins above bubble. They are top 50 in net and have a 500 record against BPI top 50 opponents. And they have a nice schedule to try and bolster that resume against New Mexico, San Diego State, and Utah State, all bubble mid-major teams competing against them. But I do think that it didn't necessarily budge them, and they're looking at a very high mountain to climb themselves in terms of potentially winning the Mountain West Conference. And then let's talk about the Bradley Braves. I do feel like the Bradley Braves are a team that's been counted out a lot in terms of the last couple of years because they've only made one NCAA tournament appearance in 2006. But I do think that they're appealing in the MVC. They only have really Drake to worry about in the conference tournament. They've got a resume booster against Southern Illinois Monday. They're playing this Sunday against Drake, so potentially another nice win on their dock before heading into the conference tournament. But they don't want to leave anything to chance, the Bradley Braves. They don't have as strong of a strength of record as Duke, don't have as strong of a resume as Duke in terms of rankings and ratings. So I do think that Bradley is up against it, and if you really want to go down, look at a team outside any of the mid-major conferences. How about the UC San Diego Tritons? They're at 61%. They're the only non-power conference team right now on ESPN's forecast and mid-major team with at least a 10% chance at an at-large entry. And I feel like as a Big West team, this is a conference that even though they're not a power conference, has the opportunity, along with UC Irvine, to send both of these schools into the tournament for the first time since 2005. And I feel that that's warrants very special status in terms of this, because very rarely do we see these non-power conference or majors teams crack a threshold of even 60% to get into the tournament. So that's very special. A couple of teams who unfortunately are on the outside looking in: the North Texas Mean Green, the Dayton Flyers, the Jacksonville State Gamecocks, Middle Tennessee State, and the Northern Iowa Panthers. Unfortunately, they don't necessarily fit the threshold of a team, but ultimately, these mid-majors are all teams that I feel sit in the range of potential auto bids to having to win their conference tournament. I feel that out of all of these teams, VCU has the best chance of an at-large bid should they get eliminated in their conference tournament, but I'm not necessarily counting out the possibility that maybe several of these teams on the outside looking in by Selection Sunday. So it's going to be a grind for these mid-major teams to get into the tournament, especially in their conference tournaments. But we'll see in the coming weeks how this all shapes out. But coming up next to conclude today's show, we do a final segment with our low mid-majors, assessing a little bit more of the Gonzagas and St. Mary's of the world before concluding our Bubble Watch for good. And right back to conclude the show, the week, and our Bubble Watch segments after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast for our final segment of the show and the week, and most importantly, our Bubble Watch for March Madness this season, and we get into some of the low mid-major teams, potential Cinderellas as well, to conclude today's show. Now, a lot of them are familiar faces, but they potentially are in unfamiliar territory for some of you. For example, who would have thought St. Mary's would be more of a lock to make the NCAA tournament at this juncture of the season than the Gonzaga Bulldogs in the Western Coast Conference? We'll talk a little bit more about Utah State trying to make history in their program. We'll talk a little bit more about a team like San Diego State and how they can continue their ascension as one of the better mid-major conference teams in the country. And then a team like New Mexico, we have a lot, the list goes on and on to talk about for these low mid-major teams. But ultimately, kind of surprising to see certain teams not as certain to make the tournament as years past. But let's start off with the two locks that we are confident in saying will make the NCAA tournament out of these low mid-major conferences thus far. The Memphis Tigers really have turned the corner under Coach Penny Hardaway this season. And the reason why I think they're primed for a deep run is that they don't necessarily have players past years like Jalen Duren to carry them. And because of that, there's no noise surrounding them that they need to overperform and exceed expectations. They're right where they need to be, and Penny is coaching them at a high level. I really love the outside-inside duo of Dane Danger and PJ Haggerty on this team, and they're only going to grow under Penny Hardaway. He's instilled the philosophy of a winning culture at this program yet again. And I feel like that out of all the mid-majors that we can really talk about today, the Memphis could be the one that is a dark horse in March Madness, and you wouldn't even be surprised if they went into, at the very least, the Sweet 16 as your dark horse as well. And then let's talk about the surprise team. Not necessarily surprising because they've been gaining on Gonzaga over the past couple of years, finally kind of overtaken them a lot in people's minds in terms of who's the cream of the crop in the West Coast Conference. The St. Mary's Gales at 100%, or 99% just now, not fully there yet. But what I love about the St. Mary's Gales team is that they're a team of trees, man. This team is big man heavy. You have your experienced big man, which I really like, in Mitchell Saxon and Augustus Marciulionis. But they have even more guys when you look at this roster waiting for their roles as big men in the West Coast Conference. And that's what I love about this team. You don't often see a team like St. Mary's go far in the tournament with a team loaded at the center position, but I feel like they can make a lot of teams uncomfortable that way, playing through the force down low. And that's why, in terms of these lower mid-major conferences, it's always important to analyze the rosters of these respective teams when you're making decisions in your bracket on who to choose as your potential Cinderella. For Memphis, it's more of the classic inside-outside duo. They kind of play more like a power conference team than anyone in the mid-major conferences. But for St. Mary's, you should be definitely appealed by a team with that many big men. Because in college basketball, yes, it's starting to become a little bit more center-centric, so to speak, but not to the extent of St. Mary's. And that's potentially the reason why Gonzaga is losing a lot of its luster. It's because St. Mary's is doing things that not a lot of college teams are willing to do, playing with big men. We see it in power conferences. Michigan's been doing it to a T this season. We see how potentially in other situations where you're not necessarily center heavy like North Carolina, you falter and ultimately have to potentially win your conference tournament to get in. So I always say that if you're looking at a mid-major team, always note who's on the roster and at what positions most importantly. Sometimes scoring averages, stats don't matter. It's about the complexion and makeup of the team that really stands out when you're making these decisions for your bracket. Now let's talk with the team St. Mary's has, quote-unquote, beaten out as a top team in the West Coast Conference. Still a top team themselves, but not necessarily at the level of years past. The Gonzaga Bulldogs. They don't really, in my mind, have that elite player that can win a game like they have in recent years. They don't have, quote-unquote, a Jalen Suggs type player in their ranks. I don't have a Drew Timme in their ranks, I don't think. They do have an elite big man in Graham Ike, and Ben Gregg is holding his own, and Ryan Nembhard is a fantastic distributor of the basketball, 9.9 assists average this season. But the reason why they're not as elite in years past is because they have trouble simply beating the elite teams. They are 1-5 against the BPI's top 50 opponents, and they really, in the West Coast Conference, don't necessarily have the schedule and the pedigree outside of who they play in the non-mid-majors. I think that Gonzaga's looking at a chance where if they don't win their conference tournament, it could be between them and St. Mary's. And I feel like, though it's tough to leave them out because they still look good in all the rankings and ratings that, appeal to the selection committee, I just feel like this is not your early 2020s Gonzaga team, late 2010s Gonzaga team. I feel like they have a lot of talent, but it's not the kind of talent that sways you in terms of thinking that this team can, like teams of Gonzaga past, go on deep runs. And that's what kind of separates them ever so slightly in my mind from the locks of the mid-majors and them right now, because they don't really have that resume-boosting win for their squad. Now let's talk a little bit more about the Utah State Aggies. I kind of had to fill time last segment to get ahead in this segment, but I really like the profile of this Utah State team just because they're on a kind of a run in their program's history. This will be their third consecutive NCAA tournament trip if they make it. They have the highest SRS rating in program history. They have a 9-3 record against top 100 competition, but I feel like they're all over the place in terms of where they stand. They play in a very interesting conference in the Mountain West where you have teams like San Diego State and Boise State who could still be considered for the selection committee as well. But I do think that very balanced roster as well. Not necessarily one relying too much on one player, which I really like. And ultimately, they have a lot of confidence. Ian Martinez, an elite player. Mason Falslev, another great guy to have down low. But ultimately, this Utah State team is trying to become one of those mid-majors who can be consistent in terms of their NCAA tournament appearances. And what I like about them is that in a Mountain West Conference that could be changing in the very near future in terms of not just football but potentially basketball, Utah State could gain an advantage in that respect as well. So look out for this team as the Mountain West landscape in certain sports changes in their favor. Then let's talk about the team competing against them for Mountain West supremacy this season, the San Diego State Aztecs. I really like this Aztecs team a lot. 48th in net, their 42nd strength of record. They have an 8-3 conference record, which selection committees really love, but they are kind of a toss-up just because I feel like the Mountain West Conference, even being the conference that in the mid-majors will probably produce the most teams, might not necessarily be inclusive for a team like San Jose State, because the number of teams from the Mountain West is dropping, even though it remains above, say, the A10 threshold, the MVC threshold. So I'm looking at San Diego State as someone to really look out for in terms of not just the conference tournament, but the regular season itself, because that would really boost their resume in my eyes. So, San Diego State again, another appealing team with an inside-outside duo to look out for, so they make the tournament in Miles Bird and Magoon Guath. But overall, still a team in my eyes that really needs that resume-boosting win to really overcome that threshold and ensure that they have an opportunity to make the tournament. But in terms of the mid-major picture here, in recent years, you view the mid-majors as how you kind of deciphered what you would do with your bracket, right? Because a lot of the time, you can find a potential underdog in the power conferences, but not to the extent of, say, a mid-major team that has a talent to go at least 2 weekends. This year, I can kind of see a difference, a major difference between even the weakest of the power conferences and the mid-majors. And that could be a concern to you when you're building your bracket. So, like I just did for these segments, if you're willing to hedge your bets on a mid-major in this year's March Madness tournament, you would have to assess the roster, assess the matchup they get in the first round, and say, is this team capable of pulling it off? Because I feel like a lot of mid-major talent are either transferring to power conference or trying their luck in, say, the G League. So I do feel that's where I kind of see mismatches for these mid-majors going up against these elite power conference teams. And now that there's a lot of depth in them, I'm really intrigued to see how the mid-major teams handle these very deep power conferences and their elite teams. So it's definitely going to be weird to see how a lot of these teams handle it, even the cream of the crop in these conferences. But I do feel like there's not really one that stands out to me in terms of potential Cinderella. Maybe VCU, maybe, USU this year. But I can't really say because I can see that big of a chasm between them and the power conferences. But let me know what you think in the comments below, because that will just about do it for today's show, the Bubble Watch segments, and the week here on the GSMC's Ball Sports Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in throughout the week. I've been Chris Shepard. We'll be back Monday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as always, for another great week of shows. But other than that, out for today. See y'all next week.